Hi, I'm Mattanah DeWitt, joined by Dr. Luke Bray. Welcome to Discover Your Roots, a podcast that will give you the tools for understanding and applying the wisdom of the Bible in your own context. In Season 3, we're focusing on Christian advocacy. We're trying to understand how Christian theology shapes what or who we advocate for, why we advocate, and how we advocate. As sin causes our world to become increasingly more divided, our society has moved from worshiping God to worshiping self. Christians need to understand how to combat division with unity. How should Christians advocate for others? What do the teachings of the Bible have to say about advocacy? How should Christians advocate for the Jewish community amidst rising antisemitism? We're unpacking all of this in Season 3 of Discover Your Roots. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Discover Your Roots, Season 3. And we are on episode 11. So we are almost getting to the end of our series, and we're so grateful that you have joined us for this journey and joined us for all these really in-depth, hopefully helpful discussions about what it looks like to be an advocate that really embodies the heart of Jesus for people, cares for people, and is willing to actually put hands and feet to the teachings of Jesus. So we have gotten into the section of this series where we're not just talking about Christian advocacy in general, but we're also talking about a specific side of advocacy that is advocacy for the Jewish people. So as we begin to kind of dive deeper into this discussion, I'm going to frame our conversation, as I usually do, with 3 questions that will kind of help anchor us, and then we'll come back at the end with some key takeaways related to those questions. So let's set the stage for this conversation. The first question is going to be, what has been the historical Jewish experience? Number 2 is, have Christians supported the Jewish people historically? We talked about that a little bit in the previous episode, but we're going to go even more in depth in this episode. And then the third question is, what are the threats facing the Jewish people today or opportunities for Christians to advocate for them? So I'm joined once again by Dr. Luke Bray, who has been with us for this whole season and has been able to share some of his experiences and expertise on these topics. Today, we are joined by another very special guest who I'm very excited to introduce you to. My friend Anna Babcox is with us today. She is the Associate Director of Advocacy and Strategy at Passages and is really the perfect person to be speaking into these topics with us. So a couple things about her. She spent a lot of time learning about Jewish-Christian relations and the threats facing the Jewish people today. She also lived in Israel for 2 years, which not many people can say. And her day job consists of finding ways for Passages alumni to build bridges of friendship with the Jewish people. So Anna, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, Mattanah. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Do you want to share a fun fact about yourself with us, or with the audience?
Well, I would say probably the most unexpected thing is that I actually have a background in law enforcement. So long before I got into Israel work, I was planning to be a police officer. That was the life's goal, and I actually had an internship at my local sheriff's office. I wasn't a cop, but so I thought I was going to be a cop, and then I went on my first Passages trip. And everything changed everything. Yeah.
Wow. And here you are today.
Here I am.
I love it. Well, thank you for being here with us. We're excited to kind of pick your brain, your amazing brain, and to really have you contribute to this very important conversation today. So, Anna, I would like to start by asking you to describe the historical Jewish experience. No big deal. Not a big request at all. There's been a lot more history than just that which we find in the Bible, which we've talked a little bit about. But over the past 2,000 years, there's been a lot of history in the history of the church as well. So as we think about kind of extra biblically, outside of the Bible, history outside of the Bible, what are we missing? Maybe as Christians that are coming to this conversation, what do we need to know about the history as we come into this conversation?
Yeah. Well, and extra biblical is important, but you have to start in the Bible, and I think the best place to start is actually in Genesis. And Genesis it literally in Hebrew means the beginning, Bereshit. So starting in the Bible, Bereshit, from the beginning, Genesis 32, we have the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel of God. And that night he sort of wins the fight, but he leaves wounded. He leaves with a limp. And after this encounter with the angel of the Lord, he leaves that place with a new name, and his name is Yisrael, or what means to wrestle with God, El Elohim, because he is the one who has wrestled. And throughout the story of the Jewish people, from Jacob until the modern age, sort of the story of the Jewish people has been one marked by tragedy, and this counter-cultural experience of Jewish people is to take all of that tragedy and sort of transform it into something other than victimhood. They actually identify themselves as survivors. So from generation after generation, there's this understanding that they have been oppressed, but they have survived that oppression. And when you're a group of people who are ordained to wrestle with God, that you are named after the wrestling with Elohim, sort of the struggle with man isn't as daunting. There's something about it that's expected. This wrestle is built into the name Israel. After the horrific attacks of October 7th, something many of my Jewish friends were telling me was, oh, this is what my grandparents were telling us about. This is what they talked about. This is what they experienced. So we have this overarching narrative that has suddenly repeated itself in modern time. There's this sort of shared universal understanding among different Jewish communities of torment, generational trauma, and it's really just passed from Jacob today. There's also no other group on earth that has survived this much persecution and survived this long. And Christianity is a close second. So since the foundation of Christendom, we've sort of had to deal with persecution as well. And that makes us spiritual siblings. So we sort of understand that with the gospel comes persecution. And so we do have a shared understanding with Jewish people in that way. And the Christian scriptures and teachings almost promise suffering to us as Christians as well. We know that we have the joy of Christ, but that we are also required to pick up our cross and follow him.
That's beautiful and so true, and also really helpful to have that kind of very foundational understanding from a biblical historical perspective. We were talking about it in some previous episodes. Dr. Bray and I were talking about this, about how, there's a cost to advocacy. There's a cost to, and you were just talking about just now of, with Christianity comes a cost. There's a price to be paid, and so I think that's important for us to bear that in mind as we have this conversation, that it's costly to, as Christians, for us to advocate, for us to stand up and do the right thing. But there are those who've gone before us who have also experienced what it's like to have that costly place. So, Luke, kind of along with what Anna just shared, she shared about the suffering and tragedy that has kind of marked Jewish identity from the very beginning. Scripture really sets the tone for that for the rest of Jewish history. So, did the Jewish people ever have any support in Scripture during these wrestling matches, so to speak, or are they supported? Are they supposed to kind of be left to their own, like left on their own in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously this kind of isolation that they end up experiencing or feeling throughout the Bible, but we see different stories also within the Scriptures, whether it's the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament, where they're not alone. They're not left to fend for themselves and kind of fight through all of this by themselves. In the text, we see different stories. I think one example that is, that immediately jumps into your mind is in the book of Joshua. The people of Israel are given a supernatural, like a crazy victory over the city of Jericho, and part of the reason that they're victorious is because of a woman, and she's a Gentile, a Canaanite woman named Rahab. And so, like, that story, and you end up seeing Rahab. She finds her way into the genealogy of Jesus, and so she's a part of this massive story that's unfolding with the people of Israel and the arrival of Messiah. So another element or another story may be the lineage and succession of King David. We see Ruth, who was a Moabite, but she also is included in the genealogy of Jesus. But she is a woman who has a significant story or part in a story in Israel's history. And in fact, she has an entire book named after her in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is unusual. And yet she's a Gentile. So, like, her story really plays a part of what is happening in the story of Israel. After the Babylonian exile, Cyrus the Great returned the people to their land and gave them the resources needed for them to rebuild the temple and to begin to faithfully worship the Lord again. So you have this example of a Gentile king sending the people of Israel back where they needed to be in relationship to God, to their own land, and actually funding the operation to build the temple. Another incredible kind of support for the Jewish people. So there's a long-standing tradition of the Lord using outsiders or Gentiles to execute His will and to encourage and support His people in their role as, what they're supposed to be is the light to the nations.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's really great context. Thank you for that. Anna, I want to take a slightly different turn kind of in the direction of what we're talking about and think about how we got to this point. So the Bible finishes with the Jewish people in Israel under Roman occupation, and that's kind of where we're left, and there's a big gap between that moment in history to where we are today. So can you kind of fill in some of those gaps for us?
Yeah. So between 70 AD and 130 AD, the Jewish people are forced out of the land of Israel, and they're scattered by the Romans. And this all began with the destruction of the Second Temple. This period was also called, the beginning of this period is called the diaspora. So where Jews have lived all around the world in places, as far as you can think, there's been Jews there. This experience was generally defined by varying degrees of persecution as well. It was pretty well documented. Wherever Jewish people went, they suffered persecution wherever they were. They were often viewed as being suspicious, not trustworthy. They were often accused of religious, social, political evils of many kinds. They were scapegoated for all kinds of problems that they had nothing to do with, and they were accused of vast conspiracy theories throughout history. As a result, they were isolated. Most were forced to convert, abused, or even killed, depending on the situation, depending on the environment. They all experienced this kind of pressure and demonization.
Wow. What role did Christians play in that? And I'll give a little bit of context too. In the previous episode, we touched on this just a little bit about the kind of the role that Christianity at large had in previous times in really persecuting the Jewish people at times. And there's some obviously continued baggage around, like, it's difficult. It's a difficult history, that we're kind of walking into as Christians today. So we talked about that a little bit in the previous episode, but would love to hear from you. What role did Christians play in this? What did that look like?
Yeah. Unfortunately, Christians contributed in this persecution a lot, both religiously and politically. Christians accused Jews of being Christ killers, so responsible for the death of Christ. They were also called bloodthirsty children of Satan, and that specifically refers to something called a blood libel. And what that meant was, especially in Europe, there was this conspiracy theory that Jews would kill Christian babies, drain their blood, and then bake the blood into the Passover matzah, which is the most disgusting, ridiculous idea you could possibly imagine. But of course, this conspiracy spread like wildfire, and many people were blaming Jews for murdering Christian children. St. Augustine of Hippo said that the true image of the Jew is Judas Iscariot. John Chrysostom said that Christians may never seek vengeance. It is incumbent on all Christians to hate the Jews. Ambrose of Milan said, I declare that I set fire to the synagogue, or at least ordered those who did it, that there might be a place where Christ is denied. Who will avenge the Jews? And Martin Luther said that rabbis should be forbidden to teach on pain of loss of life and limb. And unfortunately, we have so many quotes that we could read, and it would take up the entire podcast. There have been so many Christians who have spoken horrendous things against Jewish people, and I think it's important as Christians to understand that we have a role in this, and we have contributed as Christians to the persecution of the Jewish people. There are, of course, also some counter examples, and there have been people who have stood up. However, there have been far too many cases where the Jewish people were treated terribly by Christians in the name of Christ, and especially throughout Europe.
It's really heavy. It's difficult to kind of wrestle with that. You talk about wrestling. It's difficult to wrestle with that reality, especially as Christians coming into this. Luke, I want to pause here for a second. It's a heavy thing to think about, as Christians, and I'm curious if you can speak into that specifically. How do you think Christians should think about this news? This may be new news for some people listening. Like, some people may be aware, but this may be like, wow, okay, I did not know that.
Right.
For some people listening to this right now. So how should we think about this? Are we still today, Christians today, responsible for the sins of the past?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Christians in every age have made horrible mistakes. It's not something that happened 1,500 years ago and, it was a, one shot and boom, everybody made a mistake. And now everything we do nowadays is great. In every era, there are Christians who don't fully understand the things that they're experiencing. They make terrible mistakes. They make judgments that are wrong. Terrible injustices take place. The influence of human greed for power and fame and money drive us even as we're attempting to walk, as we've been talking about, in the way of Jesus. And so this, of course, is true in the lives of some of the individuals that Anna mentioned just a second ago, whether it's John Chrysostom, literally the most influential preacher of the 4th century, who is said to have had the golden mouth, right? Everybody listened to him. Or to Martin Luther, who is the celebrated theologian who began the Reformation and helped us secure our focus on faith alone in Christ alone, and the primary importance of the Scriptures as being the authority in our lives. But doing things like this or having this kind of influence does not mean that you get everything right. And I think those are two glaring examples of how Christians got it wrong. And so in every age, Christians err. So whether it's the treatment of the Jews, whether it's chattel slavery and that enterprise, or the lackluster protection from Christians over the last 50 years about human life, not just unborn, but elderly people being marginalized or trafficked. All of these things, we see problems in almost every era, and the way that Christians respond is not always great. It's not always best. I would not say that we bear the responsibilities of our forebears in these sins, but that we live in the wake of their action or their inaction, and that has consequences. Particularly for our Jewish friends, they're wise to be suspicious of Christians, right? I don't doubt them for that. I don't, that I understand. Most of their history is filled with stories of either Christians seeking to change them, convert them, which in their mind doesn't have as much to do with Jesus as it does with the removal of their Jewish identity. Or Christians are looked at with suspicion because they've been the group who most often have instigated or celebrated attacks on their communities. And so guilt is not the primary reason why we support the Jewish people today. And if that was the primary reason we support the Jewish people or advocate for them, I think it would be very hollow and it wouldn't have very much meaning. As Christians, we can be advocates for the Jewish people because they're made in the image of God and because God chose them to bless the world through covenant given through Moses, and even more significantly, God gave a new covenant through his son who is Jewish so that we might all have life and have life that is truly abundant. So
Thank you. That's really helpful. Good. Very helpful for this conversation. Anna, before we get to more current events, I want to reference something that we talked about a couple episodes ago, which is collective trauma. For the Jewish people, an extremely fresh example is the Holocaust, and it didn't happen that long ago. How do you think this shaped the Jewish community?
Yeah. Well, the Holocaust was far more than just persecution. It was the systematic approach and an attempt to wipe out the Jewish people completely. And as I mentioned earlier, when most of Europe had been steeped in this anti-Semitic sort of ideology for so long, it was easy to sort of accept some of the ideas that the Nazis were trying to implement. And the Jewish community fundamentally changed. It felt more vulnerable, not only because of this visceral memory and because of this tragedy, but because they had lost so many people. Just the sheer number of loss is something you can't even get your mind around. And I was actually in Auschwitz this spring, and there's like a lot of different visual attempts to try and bring your mind to what 6 million looks like, but the loss is so great. So when your people have been reduced by such a great size, it's visceral, it's tangible, it's real loss. Before the Holocaust, the population of Jewish people in the world was estimated to be between 15 to 17 million people, but with the loss of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. The entire population of Jewish people in the whole world today is roughly 14 million, and 9 million of those live in Israel. So just for a little context to try and help us get to this number, there's around 20 million Seventh-day Adventists today. And it's easy to say that like that denomination of Christianity is far less known than Jewish people. And I'll give an example of what it feels like kind of to be Jewish right now. A few weeks ago, a Jewish woman living in America told me a story of her car breaking down. And she was in an unfamiliar area. Her car sort of just coasted off the highway into this gas station. And she just asked the gas attendant for help. After a little while, another young man sort of approached and helped. And, they had the hood up and they're looking, what's wrong with this car? What's wrong with the engine? And as the young man sort of leaned over the engine, his Magen David, which is the Star of David, necklace just sort of fell out of his shirt. So she didn't see it before, but as soon as he leaned over, she saw the necklace fall out. And she told me, then I knew we were going to be okay. Then I knew he's one of us. And that's what we're doing all the time. We're constantly scanning every single person we meet, friend or foe. And thank God in this situation, it was a friend. It's okay.
And that's what she told you.
This is what she told me.
Wow.
This is just a couple weeks ago. And the hypervigilance is a defense mechanism, and it's refined by generations of persecution, and also the current environment that they find themselves in. It's both. They feel very vulnerable at times, and especially in a situation, your car is broken down on the side of the road. You want to know that you're among friends. So it's a very real thought on the mind of most Jews and Jewish Americans as well.
Wow. even despite this horrific tragedy that was the Holocaust, and even horrible anti-Semitic things that have happened even since then, in our own country even, it seems like Jewish-Christian relations has begun to improve over the last few decades. Why do you think that is?
Well, there have definitely been Christian heroes. There's heroes like Maximilian Kolbe, Corrie ten Boom, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They sort of represent the practitioners of this sacred tradition that you were talking about, the Gentile defense and support of the Jewish people. They make up an elite class of something called the righteous among the nations, and this is a term, if you've ever been to Yad Vashem in Israel, you'll know what that means. But these were the people who, the non-Jews in Europe who defended Jewish people, who hid them, who rescued them during the Holocaust. They represent 0.005% of the population of Europe. They risked their lives resisting the Nazis, but they're a small and elite unit of mostly Christians in this case, these heroes like Maximilian Kolbe and ten Boom and Bonhoeffer. But this awareness and willingness to stand up for the Jewish people has helped restore some faith, to build some friendship. I think also after the Holocaust, Christians have been very mindful of this history that we've had, and realize that we have a lot of work to do in deep conversation and friendship that has begun recently.
Wow. So let's talk about today. What do Christians need to know about the threats facing the Jewish people today?
Well, as I mentioned before, a lot of my Jewish friends have told me this is what my grandparents told me about. This is what they lived through in Europe. This is what my friend at a gas station experienced. Is this someone gonna help me, or is this person gonna hurt me? And that's real. Since October 7th in the United States, anti-Semitism has risen by 400%, which again is like a number that like seems too big to visualize. Like, how do I, like, what is 400%? But acts of anti-Semitism include graffiti. They include physical intimidation and attacks, and this, all of these actions are designed to specifically target Jewish people and make them feel afraid, make them feel worried for their safety. And like by graffiti, we're talking about swastikas and death threats. This is all very, very real, and it makes the Jewish people go back in their generational trauma, in that shared collective memory of, I've seen this before. This was the 30s. This was there's so many comparisons being made to pogroms and the history of Jewish persecution. So that's what's happening right now. That's the conversation in the Jewish world. They are being subject to lies and conspiracy theories today. It's pretty easy to find something online or in the ether about Jews being responsible for whatever ill our society doesn't like right now. They're often scapegoated. They are being physically barred from entrance to elite institutions, denied access to their university campuses and dorms, held back from attending classes, and physically being threatened and attacked daily.
This is happening in our own country right now.
Yeah.
Luke, how do you think Christians should respond to this news? What is our kind of mandate as it relates to this awful reality that we see?
Yeah, I think just to kind of think about this in the context of the things that we've been talking about over the last several episodes, as we think about what it means to be followers of Jesus, and kind of walking in the pattern that he's kind of put out there for us, walking in the way of Jesus. We are called to care about the things that he cares about, called to care about the people that he cares about. And I think we've talked about this in the last couple of episodes, like, why should we care about the Jewish people? Because he cares about the Jewish people. How should we do this? well, we should do it in the way that he did it. And so I think for myself, when I think about all of the things that are happening right now around our country, around the world, as Christians, we have to come to a point where we're willing to really have genuine empathy. Because, I mean, think about all the stuff we were just talking about with like the collective trauma that they've experienced over the last 2,000 years at the hands of Christians. And yet here we are, Christians, wanting to be helpful. And so we approach this conversation already with a bit of baggage in our hands. And so we have to be humble and recognize that we don't have all of the answers to fix the problems. In fact, traditionally, like one could say that we have been the problem in the way that they've been treated in large part. And so we want to come to this table with humility and with genuine empathy because we want to have incarnational compassion toward them. And so we want to care deeply. And so we're asking, I think, one, we have to pray. We have to pray first that God would help us to have compassion, help us to have empathy like he does. But then we have to intercede for them, praying that God would protect them, praying that God would use us to be a help to them as they're walking through these things. And so genuine empathy, but then it can't stop there because that's what we've been talking about, what James is talking about, right? If all we are doing is sitting on a podcast and talking about it, if we're just writing a blog and posting it, we're believing good things, yay. But James says, well, that's a stupid thing to just do that, right? He says, that's foolish. So don't just be a person who says, I have faith, but be a person who has faith, and that faith inspires us to act. And so I think for us as believers in Jesus, walking in the way of Jesus, caring about the things he cares about, caring about the people he cares about, we have to have moral and spiritual courage because stepping out and doing the right thing, calling things that are evil, evil, and calling things that are good, good, that takes courage right now in our culture. And doesn't mean we have to be lightning rods in our community. Doesn't mean that we have to be the person that, is, making everybody angry and, leading a protest or something like that. But what it does mean is we have to stand up and we have to speak out against the things that God hates and speak for the things that God cares about, which is justice and goodness and kindness and love. And so we have to have genuine empathy, but we also have to have courage. Be courageous. Do the things that God requires of us. And what are those things? Act justly, love your God, walk humbly, right? Those kinds of things. Love mercy, walk humbly with God. So
thank you so much for tying in all of those really incredible truths that we've been talking about in this whole season into this moment. I think that's really important that we kind of integrate what we've already been talking about and learning. So thank you, Luke and Anna, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us in this episode, specifically on this topic. We've wrestled with some painful realities today, for sure, but I think that they're really important ones and ones that are necessary for us to talk through. So appreciate your help with that. A few takeaways, as we do at the end of every episode. I'll just share these with you so you can kind of think back through what we've talked about and have some highlights. So the first main takeaway is the Jewish experience throughout history has been defined by tragedy and suffering. Anna kind of talked about that and brought us through some of those really painful realities. Number two, God has used Gentiles repeatedly to advocate for and support the Jewish people. Anna mentioned the righteous among the nations, those who have stood for justice, those who have stood for what's right, those who have stood up for the Jewish people in moments when it mattered most. Number three, the Jewish people are still under attack today, even after the world shunned the horrors of the Holocaust. Many people said, never again, never again. And yet we see some of those same patterns still happening today. Number four, Christians should seize the opportunity to be the righteous among the nations who will speak up against lies and injustices. And Luke brought that point home so clearly just toward the end of this episode. when he mentioned how it's important for us to stand up, to speak up, and whatever tools God gives us in the context that we're in, to stand up for what's right, to call evil evil and good good, to be advocates for what God says is right. In our next episode, we're going to dive into the practicalities of what it looks like to be the righteous among the nations today. So there are hopeful things coming, and we hope to equip you with some tools to really put some of the things that we've been talking about into action. So until next time, we'll see you then.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Discover Your Roots. For more resources, check out the links in the show notes and follow us on Instagram at Passages Israel. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.